In 1983, the government of Ghana was broke. Not metaphorically broke. Literally unable to pay its civil servants. Unable to import the fuel that kept its hospitals running. Unable to service its foreign debt. Unable to maintain the basic functions of a state. The cedi, Ghana's currency, had lost approximately 90% of its value in the preceding decade. Inflation was running at approximately 120% per year. The cocoa sector, which was Ghana's primary export earner, and the foundation of whatever prosperity the country had enjoyed since independence, had collapsed. Production had fallen from approximately 450,000 tons in 1965 to approximately 160,000 tons in 1983. As farmers abandoned their crops rather than sell them to the government marketing board at prices that were a fraction of what they could earn on the black market. Ghana in 1983 was a country on the edge of economic collapse, governed by a military regime under Jerry Rawlings that had come to power in a coup in 1981, and that was running out of options. The International Monetary Fund arrived with a solution. The solution was called a structural adjustment program. It required Ghana to devalue its currency, to liberalize trade by removing import restrictions, to eliminate subsidies on food and fuel, to cut government spending, to privatize state enterprises, to liberalize agricultural pricing by abolishing the government cocoa marketing board's monopoly, and to open the Ghanaian economy to foreign investment and international competition. In exchange for implementing these measures, Ghana would receive IMF loans that would stabilize its balance of payments and give it access to the international financial markets from which it had been effectively cut off. Ghana implemented the program. The immediate results were painful. Liberalization and devaluation produced sharp increases in the prices of basic goods, government spending cuts reduced public services, and the elimination of subsidies hit the poorest Ghanaians hardest. The medium-term results were more positive. Cocoa production recovered dramatically, inflation fell, GDP growth resumed, and Ghana became, in the 1990s and early 2000s, one of the World Bank's most frequently cited African success stories. And then, in December 2022, Ghana went to the IMF again. It was facing a debt crisis, a combination of foreign borrowing accumulated over the preceding decade, an external shock from commodity price movements and the COVID-19 pandemic, and domestic fiscal management that had allowed deficits to accumulate to levels that the government could not sustain. The terms of the new IMF program were, in their essential features, remarkably similar to the terms of the 1983 program: currency adjustment, fiscal consolidation, structural reforms, debt restructuring. Ghana, which had been an IMF success story for 30 years, was back at the starting point. The generation that was supposed to have been saved by structural adjustment had produced, through a combination of external pressures and domestic governance failures, the conditions that required structural adjustment again. This is the central paradox of the IMF's relationship with Africa, and it is the paradox that this video examines. The structural adjustment programs that the IMF and the World Bank imposed on African countries from the early 1980s onward were presented, and in some dimensions were, an appropriate response to the genuine fiscal and economic crises that African governments had created. The fiscal deficits were real. The overvalued currencies were real. The state-owned enterprises that were draining government resources were real. The economic mismanagement of the post-independence decades was real, and its consequences were severe. In this sense, the structural adjustment critique of post-independence African economic policy had genuine validity. But the structural adjustment programs that the IMF designed as the solution to these problems were not primarily designed from an analysis of what would most effectively promote African development. They were designed from an ideological framework, the Washington Consensus, that reflected the specific intellectual and political environment of the Reagan and Thatcher era, that had been developed primarily in the context of Latin American economies rather than African ones. And that was applied to African countries with a rigidity and a speed that prevented the kind of gradual, sequenced, institutionally grounded reform that successful development historically requires. The programs were also designed in ways that served the interests of the creditor countries and the private financial institutions that held African debt, in ways that were not always aligned with African development interests. The result was not simply that structural adjustment programs failed to develop Africa. The result was something more specific and more damaging. The programs systematically dismantled the state capacity that African governments had been building since independence. The agricultural marketing boards, the state enterprises, the public health and education systems, the industrial policy frameworks, without replacing them with alternative institutions capable of performing the same functions. They opened African economies to international competition before those economies had developed the institutional and technological foundations to compete. They created debt obligations that consumed a growing share of African government revenues. And they transferred effective economic policy-making authority from African governments to the IMF and the World Bank in Washington, producing exactly the kind of external economic control over African affairs that independence had been supposed to end. To understand what the IMF actually did to Africa, you have to begin not in 1983 with the Ghanaian crisis, but in 1957 with independence, with the specific character of the African independence project, and the specific economic choices that African governments made in the decade and a half between independence and the debt crises of the early 1980s. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president, the architect of Ghanaian independence, and the most prominent intellectual force of Pan-African nationalism in the late 1950s and early 1960s, understood something about African development that the IMF would subsequently deny. He understood that the colonial economic structure was not simply politically objectionable, but developmentally disabling. The colonial economy had been organized to serve metropolitan interests, to extract raw materials from Africa and export them to European industry, to use African labor at minimum cost, to prevent the development of African manufacturing that might compete with European imports. The independence of the political system without the independence of the economic system was, in Nkrumah's analysis, not genuine independence, but what he called neocolonialism, the continuation of colonial economic relationships under a new political form. Nkrumah's economic program was designed to break this structure. Ghana had inherited from British colonial rule a monoculture economy based on cocoa export. Cocoa generated the foreign exchange that paid for imports, funded the government, and sustained the economy. But cocoa prices were set in international commodity markets that Ghana could not control, which meant that Ghanaian economic welfare was dependent on the decisions of commodity traders in London and New York. Nkrumah intended to use the cocoa revenues to build the industrial infrastructure, steel, aluminum, chemicals, manufacturing, that would transform Ghana from a raw material exporter into an industrial economy. The Volta River Project, the construction of the Akosombo Dam, one of the largest hydroelectric projects in the world at the time of its completion, was the centerpiece of this industrialization strategy. The Volta River Project was completed in 1965. The aluminum smelter that was its primary industrial application, operated by Kaiser Aluminum, an American company, under terms that Nkrumah's critics would later identify as highly favorable to Kaiser and unfavorable to Ghana, processed aluminum using electricity generated by the dam at prices that, in the judgment of many analysts, represented a massive subsidy to an American multinational. Ghana produced the electricity. Kaiser processed the aluminum. The value added in the most capital-intensive part of the production process accrued to the American company rather than to Ghana. Nkrumah was overthrown in a military coup in February 1966 while on a trip to Hanoi. A coup in which the CIA's involvement has been documented and which the American government welcomed. His overthrow removed the most intellectually formidable advocate of genuine African economic independence from power at precisely the moment when the development model he represented was being tested. The coup also removed the specific political framework within which Ghanaian economic policy had been organized, and the governments that followed, both military and civilian, reproduced in various ways the governance failures that made Ghana vulnerable to the 1983 crisis. The debt crisis that produced the structural adjustment era in Africa was not simply the product of African economic mismanagement, though mismanagement was a real factor. It was also the product of specific external events. The oil price shocks of 1973 and 1979, which dramatically increased the import bills of African oil importing countries. The sharp increase in American interest rates in 1979 to 1982, which dramatically increased the cost of servicing the variable rate dollar debt that African governments had borrowed in the 1970s, and the commodity price collapse of the early 1980s, which reduced the export revenues that were supposed to service that debt. The specific mechanism of the debt trap that caught African countries in the early 1980s is worth understanding in detail. African governments had borrowed heavily in the 1970s, from private banks, from bilateral donors, and from multilateral institutions, at interest rates that seemed manageable in the specific context of the 1970s, which was characterized by negative real interest rates and high commodity prices. When Paul Volcker raised American interest rates to over 20% in 1979 to 1982, he was trying to end American inflation. He succeeded, and his success produced a global recession, a commodity price collapse, and a debt crisis that devastated developing countries, most dramatically in Latin America, but with comparable severity in Africa. The debt crisis was made in Washington at the Federal Reserve and exported to Africa. The IMF's response to the African debt crisis was developed within the specific ideological framework of what John Williamson would later codify as the Washington Consensus, a set of economic policy prescriptions that had been developed primarily in the context of Latin American debt crises, and that emphasized fiscal discipline, trade liberalization, privatization, deregulation, and the reduction of state intervention in the economy. The Washington Consensus was not simply an ideological imposition. It incorporated genuine insights about the fiscal irresponsibility and the economic inefficiency that had characterized many developing country governments. But it was applied to Africa with a rigidity and a speed that the specific conditions of African economies did not justify. The most consequential of the structural adjustment prescriptions for African agriculture was the abolition of the agricultural marketing boards. These institutions, which had been established by colonial governments and maintained by post-independence governments, set prices for smallholder farmers' crops, provided extension services, offered price guarantees that reduced farmers' exposure to market volatility, and sometimes provided inputs like seeds and fertilizer at subsidized prices. The marketing boards were inefficient, sometimes corrupt, and often paid farmers prices well below what the market would have provided. These were genuine problems, but the marketing boards also performed functions that markets alone could not adequately perform, particularly in the context of African smallholder agriculture, where the scale of individual operations was too small to allow individual farmers to negotiate with international commodity buyers, where access to market information was limited, where transport infrastructure was inadequate, and where the absence of rural credit markets made farmers dependent on advance purchases from the boards. When the marketing boards were abolished, rapidly as a condition of IMF lending, the market structures that were supposed to replace them did not materialize. What materialized instead was the penetration of African agricultural markets by international commodity companies, trading houses and processors that bought crops from smallholder farmers at the lowest possible prices, with no obligation to maintain the extension services and price stabilization functions that the marketing boards had provided. The liberalization of African trade, the removal of the tariff protection that had shielded nascent African manufacturing industries from international competition, was the structural adjustment prescription that produced the most direct and most visible deindustrialization. Ghana's textile industry, Zambia's copper fabrication industry, Tanzania's manufacturing sector, Zimbabwe's industrial base. These had all been built behind tariff barriers that made domestic production competitive with imports. When the tariff barriers were removed rapidly, as structural adjustment required, African manufacturers found themselves competing against Asian and European producers with dramatically lower costs, superior technology, and better access to capital. They could not compete. They closed. The deindustrialization produced by trade liberalization was not simply an economic cost. It was the elimination of the institutional foundation for the kind of industrial development that had driven economic growth in every other region of the world, in East Asia, in Europe, in the United States, at comparable stages of development. Every successful developing country that has graduated from low-income to middle-income status over the past century has done so through a period of protected industrial development, through the kind of infant industry protection that structural adjustment explicitly prohibited. The World Trade Organization's rules, which were shaped decisively by the United States and the European Union, and which were incorporated into the structural adjustment conditionality, effectively prohibited the development strategies that the United States and the European Union themselves had used to develop their own industries. The privatization of state enterprises, another central structural adjustment prescription, had similarly ambiguous consequences. Some state enterprises were genuinely inefficient, and their privatization produced efficiency gains. But many state enterprises in Africa were also performing functions, providing employment in regions with no alternative employers, maintaining infrastructure that private operators would not maintain at commercially viable prices, providing services in markets too small or too poor to attract private investment, that the private buyers who acquired them had no obligation to continue. The privatization of African telecommunications companies, water utilities, and electricity companies often produced efficiency improvements in urban areas, alongside service deterioration or withdrawal in rural areas, because the private operators rationally concentrated investment where returns were highest. The social consequences of structural adjustment in Africa were documented extensively, most powerfully by UNICEF, in a 1987 report by Cornea, Jolly, and Stewart called Adjustment with a Human Face, which argued that the structural adjustment programs had produced increases in infant mortality, malnutrition, and school dropout rates in the countries that had implemented them most rigorously. The report argued for an alternative approach, one that maintained spending on basic health and education while pursuing fiscal adjustment in other areas, that protected the poor from the immediate costs of adjustment while the long-term benefits were being realized. The IMF's response to these criticisms was to acknowledge them in principle while resisting them in practice. The Social Dimensions of Adjustment Program, launched in the late 1980s, and the subsequent Poverty Reduction and Growth Facility, which replaced the standard structural adjustment lending in the early 2000s, represented genuine attempts to incorporate social protection concerns into IMF conditionality. But the fundamental framework, fiscal austerity, trade liberalization, privatization, remained, and the specific conditions attached to lending continued to constrain African governments' ability to make the policy choices that their own assessments suggested were appropriate. The debt dimension of the structural adjustment era is the dimension that most clearly demonstrates the extent to which the program served creditor interests at the expense of African development. By the late 1990s, many African countries were spending more on debt service, on interest and principal payments to foreign creditors, than they were spending on health and education combined. The Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, launched in 1996, and the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, launched in 2005, provided partial debt cancellation for the most severely indebted African countries. But debt cancellation came with conditionalities, with requirements to implement additional structural reforms, and with the specific irony that the debts being canceled were largely the product of the structural adjustment lending that the IMF itself had provided in the preceding 2 decades. The pattern that the debt cancellation initiatives revealed was a specific and damaging one. The IMF provided loans to African governments. The loans were conditional on implementing structural adjustment. The structural adjustment programs produced economic disruptions that made it harder rather than easier for governments to achieve the fiscal targets the programs required. New loans were provided to service the old loans. The debt accumulated. Eventually, the debt became unpayable, and cancellation was necessary. And then the process began again, as Ghana's 2022 crisis demonstrated. What historians get wrong about the IMF's role in Africa is not that they describe the structural adjustment programs inaccurately. The programs are well documented. What they get wrong is the framing. The standard account presents structural adjustment as a flawed but well-intentioned attempt to address genuine African economic problems. An attempt that was sometimes too rigid and too rapid, but that reflected honest efforts by well-meaning technocrats to apply the best available economic knowledge to difficult circumstances. This framing misses the specific interests that shaped the programs and that consistently subordinated African development concerns to creditor interests, to ideological commitments, and to the commercial interests of the American and European companies that benefited from African market liberalization and African privatization. The IMF and the World Bank are institutions controlled by their major shareholders. The United States has the largest single voting share in both institutions. The major European countries collectively hold another large share. The African countries that are the primary recipients of structural adjustment programs have minimal voting power. Some of them were right. The fiscal discipline that the programs required addressed genuine fiscal irresponsibility. The removal of agricultural marketing board monopolies that were paying farmers below market prices was genuinely beneficial for farmers, even if the replacement structures were inadequate. The elimination of currency overvaluation improved the competitiveness of African exports. Acknowledging that some structural adjustment prescriptions produced genuine benefits is necessary for an honest assessment. But the honest assessment also requires acknowledging what the programs destroyed. They destroyed the possibility of the kind of developmental state, the state that directs industrial policy, protects infant industries, manages the pace of market opening, and maintains public investment in the infrastructure and human capital that markets alone will not provide, that has driven successful development in East Asia. They transferred economic sovereignty from African governments to Washington institutions in ways that independence had been supposed to prevent. They produced a generation of economic stagnation in much of Africa between 1980 and 2000, the lost decade, or in Africa's case, the lost 2 decades, that left African countries further behind the development frontier than they had been at independence. Kwame Nkrumah wrote in 1965, the year before his overthrow, that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. He was writing about political liberation, but the economic dimension of his argument, that political independence without economic independence was an incomplete form of freedom, proved prophetic. The generation of Africans who achieved political independence in the late 1950s and early 1960s found, by the early 1980s, that their country's economic policies were being designed in Washington and implemented as conditions of loans they could not refuse. This is what the IMF did to Africa in a single generation. Not through malice. The economists and officials who designed and implemented the programs were not trying to destroy African development, but through the application of a specific economic ideology within a governance structure that marginalized African voices, in service of interests that were not always aligned with African development, with a rigidity and a speed that prevented the adaptive, context-sensitive, institutionally grounded reform that successful development requires. The 30 African countries that are currently in debt distress, that are spending unsustainable proportions of their government revenues on debt service, that are back in negotiations with the IMF for new programs, that are implementing new rounds of austerity and structural reform, are living with the specific legacy of this history. The generation that was supposed to be liberated by structural adjustment has been succeeded by a generation facing the same choices their parents faced, accept IMF conditions, or face debt crisis. The generation of independence, which had imagined something different, would have recognized the pattern. If this story changed the way you think about the relationship between international financial institutions and the countries they ostensibly serve, about whether the IMF is an institution for African development or an institution for creditor protection that occasionally produces African development as a byproduct. Subscribe. Every week, we go deep on the specific mechanisms through which economic power has been exercised and the specific consequences for the populations that bore the costs. Drop a comment below on whether you think the IMF has done more harm than good in Africa. I read everyone. I'll see you in the next one.